朝の光を手放した花注がれない雨を求め覚めない眠りにつく
Horror is one of the trickiest genres out there, and I don't just mean that as a lame Halloween pun. When it's done right, it can be something really spectacular. Nothing beats the intense feelings of suspense, fear, and dread of great horror. Of course, it can also be an utter abomination highlighted by cheap thrills, a dull, predictable plot, and an arsenal of some of the worst characters you'll ever see. Unfortunately, I find that more often than not, it tends to slip into the latter. After all, it's a lot easier to throw a poorly conceived gore fest with an unbelievably stupid slew of teens running and falling for their lives than it is an insane psychological thriller that actually sticks with you beyond just nightmare fodder. So when I actually come across one of those, I'm immediately hooked. Today, under the scope, I take a look at Shiki, a horror anime that accomplishes much more than the occasional jump scare. Shiki is the classic vampire tale done right. Whether it's romanticizing the whole thing or just getting away from its roots, vampire stories tend to turn me off rather quickly. Anime tends to do them much better than Western media, but it's still hit or miss and certainly overdone. Shiki, however, takes any preconceived notions regarding shitty vampire stories and quickly blows them out of the water. What starts as a series of unexpected and seemingly unexplainable deaths in the quiet rural village of Sotoba quickly escalates into an epidemic terrorizing the community. A young doctor, Toshio Ozaki, struggles to get to the root of the problem as he watches the people he promised to protect die one after the other. Yuki Natsuno also grapples with the outbreak, haunted by the death of a girl he knew. When the two find out the truth, they realize that in order to save their people, they'll have to abandon their humanity themselves. Shiki goes well beyond the typical vampire story. It tells a gripping and ultimately tragic tale of survival, exploring the increasingly blurred line between man and monster, good and evil. The slow pace at the start works well in tandem with the subdued, mellow vibe of the setting and atmosphere. This is a show that has a specific endgame in sight and takes its time in getting there, gradually building its world and characters along the way. It's not a show that throws punch after punch each episode and never lets up on action, rather it sucks you in through its intriguing mystique and addictingly creepy atmosphere. I never found myself bored with it, as the intrigue into the world always kept me in, an essential piece of any great horror series. Shiki is really a social commentary on human nature and the power of the mob mentality and fear. When pushed to the edge, almost anybody is capable of committing horrible acts. It provides great perspective on the act of killing and survival. Characters go back and forth with each other, some stating that killing others is never justice, regardless of the noble cause one upholds, while others argue that survival is that purpose. The conflict between Shiki and humans in the show's final third is easily the highlight of the series. It doesn't want you to choose sides, no matter how badly you may want to. The show constantly illustrates how there are no winners in this battle, only losers. One of my favorite lines in the entire series really drove this point home. In order to kill demons, we have to become demons. There's a major theme of loss in the final arc. In a clever, ironic twist, it's the village that loses its humanity, not the Shiki. Even the most determined character in the series is forced to question whether any of his efforts were worth it. The slow beginning may have set up the world and characters in an occasionally tedious, repetitive manner, but the ending delivered in a big way. It certainly could have been trimmed down a bit, but your patience will definitely be rewarded. I really only had one other problem with the story beyond the slow pace at the start, and that's the final 10 seconds. I won't get into specifics for obvious spoiler reasons, but the last shot pissed me off a bit as it ruined what would have otherwise been a perfectly satisfying ending. That aside, I enjoyed the absolute hell out of it. It's a haunting illustration of what happens when people act out of fear. For the TLDR crowd, its overall message about human nature essentially boils down to this: we fucking suck. Of course, it's far more nuanced than that, leaving it completely up to you to decide who was right in their actions, although it seems to imply that nobody was. Shiki's story is its strongest asset. It's a gripping psychological horror with an extremely emotional and thought-provoking finish that really separates it from the pack. What begins as a creepy, whodunit mystery quickly morphs into an extremely nihilistic look into the erosion of a society and the worst parts of human nature, something that's sure to stick with you for a while. Now that I've got all that praise out of the way, it's time to get to the one aspect of Shiki that to put it bluntly, sucked. The characters. Can you spell unlikable? From the first episode to the last, I was constantly bombarded with one character I hated after another. Whether you want irritating teenage girls, pathetic narcissists, guys who won't stop crying, or those with horribly unexplained backstories, Shiki pretty much has someone for every type of unlikable you could think of. The very first character we see in the first episode I disliked within 15 seconds. She actually got better as the series went along, but was still an irritable bitch from start to finish. Shiki's got what just might be the most pathetic character in the history of anime, and I don't say that lightly. I kept thinking they might be trying to get to some sort of point with him, but nope. Toru was just weak. The show tried to make him this sympathetic character, but it fell far short in doing so, as he was just completely annoying. The apprentice monk Seishin initially showed a ton of promise, but that quickly dissolved in the latter half when his character motivation and backstory were swept under the rug, and I was left grasping at straws trying to figure out what the hell his purpose was. I could keep going, but in the interest of time, why don't we just skip to the characters I actually liked? Okay, moving on. In all seriousness, there were a few bright spots. My favorite character, the Dr. Toshio, is ironically enough one that I imagine gets a lot of hate. He's got plenty of unlikable character traits himself and certainly does a few reprehensible things. No, the reason he's the show's best character by far in my eyes is because he's the most relatable. His very human struggle and determination to solve this mystery and save the people he promised to save is something I think anyone can get behind. Unfortunately, somewhere along the way, he realizes everyone, including himself, has lost that very humanity he was trying to protect. His character arc is by far the most developed and well executed, ultimately leaving the greatest emotional impact. Natsuno eventually morphed into a likable character after a rough start. He initially comes off as a bit of a tool, but he gets more and more likable as the show wears on, thanks in part to his relatability as well. Overall, the problem with the majority unlikable cast, especially in a show such as this, is it left me far less connected and emotionally attached to the characters. When the show tries to make you feel sympathy for the Shiki or the humans, it doesn't quite work if you actually do want to see them lose because they're so damn unlikable. Thankfully, the writing and execution overcame the cast's deficiencies and still left a huge impact in the end. But because of those character issues, the show as a whole wasn't quite as great as it maybe could have been. Shiki's animation is certainly not going to blow you away. Sure, the backgrounds and scenery look pretty good at times, and it lends itself well to the mood and atmosphere. But for the most part, it's pretty bland. The art style, particularly the character designs, leaves a lot to be desired, with one notable exception. The Shiki's eyes looked fantastic and greatly contributed to the creepy vibe. It was a nice touch that went a long way in establishing the haunting nature of the series. That aside, however, the proportions are definitely a bit odd, and some of the designs are just downright weird. The existential struggle between the Shiki and humans is incredibly captivating for sure, but the more intriguing fight is by far the heavyweight bout between their hair and gravity. Suffice to say, hair won. The animation may have had its problems, but the soundtrack was phenomenal. The background music almost always fit the tone of the scene, and more often than not added to its impact. Some of the tracks are extremely creepy, particularly those with soft, airy choral vocals, while others are incredibly emotional. Nearly all of them, though, are simply breathtaking and certainly something I would listen to on its own. While character issues are harder to ignore, I can overlook mediocre animation for the most part when the story is as great as Shiki's was, though the character designs were definitely distracting at times. The soundtrack, on the other hand, fit the series perfectly and is honestly one of my favorites. One question I have yet to answer: will Shiki actually scare you? I should preface this by saying I don't think horror has to necessarily give you nightmares just to be considered great, though it is more often than not the reason you watch it. Shiki never put the fear of God in me, but it's definitely extremely chilling. Its top priority isn't to scare you though. Its number one goal is first and foremost to make you think. It wants you to feel an overwhelming sense of despair by the end, and not necessarily fear. That's not to say it isn't frightening at times, because it definitely is. One major difference between good and bad horror is first and foremost the depth of the story. Bad horror is rife with terrible writing, poorly explained plot twists, and a one-dimensional story. Good horror, however, is just the opposite, with excellent writing, foreshadowing, and a story that actually has meaning. Shiki does all of the above and then some, allowing it to take the jump from good to great. So with that, I award Shiki an approval rating of watch, with a definite recommendation to do so, as well as an overall score of 4.15 of Tatsumi's kick-ass jumpsuits out of 5, because his jumpsuit game was on point. It has its share of problems that drag the score down between the unlikable cast, the repetitiveness of the first half, and the character designs. However, it's got one of the better stories out there, complete with fantastic writing, and a final arc that will surely stick with you well after the last episode. Shiki is by no means the best horror anime of all time, but I feel confident in saying it's one of the best, and certainly one I highly recommend to not just horror aficionados, but anime fans in general. I should mention that the show has 2 OVA episodes, aptly numbered 20.5 and 21.5. I cannot stress enough how important it is that you watch both in the order they would naturally go in, so 20.5 goes between 20 and 21. These were 2 of the more emotionally impactful episodes in the entire series that I imagine got cut from the show's original run simply due to the high levels of gore and violence. If you're looking for something similar to Shiki, I point you towards another horror great in Higurashi no Nakukoro ni, as it has a similar setting and atmosphere, and is just a must-watch for anyone who loves horror anime. Also take a look at Shinsekai Yori for another great series that's a bit of a slow burn, but ultimately rewards your patience and then some. It has that same mystique to the world, and will ultimately make you think in the end. And that's all for me. Be sure to tune in next week as I continue Horror Month, this time taking a look at the popular Another. For an explanation of the rating system, look in the description. If you're feeling particularly generous and want to help me make better content, please consider checking out my Patreon page. Any help goes a long way. Please subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and feel free to follow me on Twitter at UTS Reviews. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time.